So a lot of you guys have liked my series of videos where I look at various, figures and communities within the alt-right. There's a sort of a spin-off of that. I kind of got the idea from doing those videos. But today I'm going to be looking at why the hard-right conservatives and law enforcement really idolize the Punisher from, the Marvel comics and the Netflix show and everything, and why they use his logo on a lot of their gear and their weapons. Because there's obviously a lot of irony with the same people who talk about being for law and order idealizing a murderous vigilante who takes justice into his own hands. But before we get any further, if you want to support my work, support this channel, please like the video, maybe subscribe, maybe share the video. Also, nearly all my content is demonetized because I tackle more edgy and controversial content that YouTube doesn't like. So if you want to support my work financially, please check out my Patreon in the description. Also, apologies if I sound a little weird, I am suffering with a cold right now. But before we get any further, I guess we have to establish who the character of the Punisher is and why people on the right and in law enforcement and the military love him so much. So, of course, lately the Punisher has become a lot more famous to many people because he had his own Netflix show. Of course, he first appeared in Daredevil Season 2 and then span off to his own little series which covered 2 seasons. And if you know anything about the Punisher character, it is pretty standard fare. Frank Castle is a veteran, his family are killed by the mob, and of course he starts to take justice into his own hands and he starts to pursue the people who killed his family, and then it evolved into a more, vigilante concept where he just tackles organised crime. Now, just like Batman, often Frank Castle's stories are more broad and they tackle bigger issues rather than focus on petty criminals. So in the Punisher show, the 2 seasons don't really focus on Frank tackling organised crime or just, drug dealers and stuff. The first season is focused on, rogue elements of the CIA. The second is focused on, an alt-right Christian group who are doing hits and stuff. And then only after those 2 seasons, he becomes, a more standard Punisher. And in my mind, the epilogue is actually one of the more problematic moments of the show. He just walks in on a drug deal and starts killing everyone. And it goes to show how the Punisher can be problematic. Just like Batman, if you take them at this level where they're just beating or killing criminals who, are just a symptom of wider neglect, wider economic problems in society, that is of course problematic. And whereas the best Batman and Punisher stories really depict these guys as pretty unhinged and how this isn't the solution, of course you have those stories which are a lot less grey and more like these guys are good and their solutions to problems are acceptable. But I guess we should focus on this part a bit more to talk about why they get adopted so much. So Frank Castle in the original comics is a Vietnam veteran. Later on he has become an Iraq veteran or an Afghanistan veteran. So certain elements within the army, and especially in America, already have an affinity for him. They feel like they can relate. And of course when someone as good as John Bernthal plays him and you throw in the PTSD angle and all this sort of stuff, there's a heavy emphasis on veterans in the show, then you can see why they like him and relate so much to him. But then you get into the problematic aspects. This is a guy who clearly needs help. This is a guy who's clearly quite unhinged. He spends his days generally going around and killing criminals because he feels there's no justice in the system. There's no rehabilitation for these guys, the guys who are similar to the people who killed his family, and the only cure for crime is a bullet. So conservatives like to paint themselves as the party of law and order. It's often, a racist dog whistle, something they like to use to basically say they're going to crush minorities or crush dissent against the government. But then obviously, as I pointed out before, it's very ironic that a lot of these groups love the Punisher. So let's quickly go through a timeline of how the Punisher and his logos and his attitude towards crime and everything has been adopted by so-called law and order conservatives and policemen. So it's perhaps not surprising a complete psycho like Chris Kyle loved the Punisher. So I want to read you a little extract of how he made this character quite popular in sort of law and order conservative circles. So Iraq veteran Chris Kyle published his memoir American Sniper, in which he distorted his war record and bragged about spray painting the Punisher logo on his unit's equipment during the 2004 Battle of Fallujah. And obviously people will know Kyle also lied about shooting looters during Hurricane Katrina, and this made him a hero to the far right. And when his book was adapted for the film in 2014, the Punisher skull gained increased currency among police unions, gun-loving militiamen and neo-Nazis. So talking about the Punisher in the book, Carl explains, He righted wrongs, he killed bad guys, he made wrongdoers fear him. We spray painted the Punisher logo on our Hummers and body armor and our helmets and all our guns. We spray painted it on every building or wall we could. We wanted people to know we're here and we want to fuck with you. Isn't that very charming of a guy who was sent to Iraq to liberate the Iraqis and help the Iraqis overthrow Saddam Hussein and set up a lovely Western government? Isn't it lovely? He's putting Punisher skulls everywhere, saying basically, we are the US military, we are going to take justice into our own hands and we're going to kill whoever we want, because that's the way we carry out justice in, the US armed forces. So naturally, the men and women who served in Iraq eventually returned to the US, and there's a good deal of interconnection between the military and the police. So it's unsurprising when American police officers also began to embrace the Punisher's logo at the start of the 21st century. Again, with a character as popular as the Punisher, it's only logical that a number of cops are already fans. However, the widespread usage of the Punisher's logo during the Iraq War likely increased the visibility of the symbol. The same reasons that the Iraqi police embraced the symbol were almost certainly the reasons why the American police did so as well. So the next turning point in the use of the Punisher as a symbol was the development of the Blue Lives Matter propaganda campaign in 2013. In 2013, the Black Lives Matter campaign launched as activists trying to highlight the systemic racism and violence that African Americans face in the US, obviously shining a light on the police killings of African Americans. In 2014, a counter movement debuted called Blue Lives Matter following the murders of 2 New York police officers. The stated goal of the movement was with a better protection for police officers, typically through laws making it a hate crime to target them. So on screen right now, I'm just going to post some iconography with Blue Lives Matter and the Punisher. You can see how this has taken a life of its own, and it seems pretty commonplace now. You see it on t-shirts, you see it on things like hats, and you see it spray painted places. Again, pretty ironic the police are idolising a guy who works outside the system and takes justice into his own hands because he feels the police are too corrupt or in the pay of, I guess, corrupt politicians and corrupt mayors, and they can't do the job effectively. But it also proves the distortion of the Punisher by these groups, where he doesn't represent any of that to them. All he represents is extrajudicial killing and taking justice into your own hands for, I guess, a positive goal in the end. In February 2017, a police department in Catlettsburg, Kentucky began featuring decals on their squad cars with the Punisher logo and the phrase Blue Lives Matter. Police Chief Cameron Logan noted that the decal represents that we will take any measures to keep our community safe, but eventually public outrage led to the removal of the decals, of course. To many people, you're literally just posting a symbol that says that you have the right to be judge, jury and executioner on any criminal. So a couple of months later, the same approach was adopted by a police department in Solvay, New York, who added a blue Punisher logo to their squad cars as part of a Blue Lives Matter tribute, and they released a statement saying that it is our way of showing our citizens that we will stand between good and evil. There is no vigilante justice that takes place in our community or within our department. So on the surface, their understanding of Frank Castle, the character, and their use of his iconography is extremely problematic. Essentially, in their minds, all Frank Castle represents is a guy who is sick of criminals, so he just stood up for himself and started killing them and, meting out justice and everything. And maybe they can take his anti-establishment message a bit further and say, well, Frank was tied down by the system, by politicians, by, I guess, liberals in Washington and local police departments, whereas we're going to take the Punisher's message. If we see crime, we're going to deal with it. And of course, a police force as militarized as the US police forces across that country, of course a police force that kills people unjustifiably, seemingly always goes for the gun first, having logos of the Punisher on their cars, you can see the problem there. It feels like they revel in this extremely violent way of dealing with crime. So what's actually quite good is that one of the original co-creators of the Punisher is really against law enforcement using the skull how they do. And I'm just going to read a couple quotes from him. They're pretty good. So his name is Gerry Conway, and the first one is, I think the way the cops use it is extrajudicial. They are cops and they are going to punish you, and the Punisher is an outlaw. He's a symbol of the failure of the justice system to treat everyone equally. About 3 years ago, when it started showing up in police cars and on challenge coins that cops were using, I was really disturbed because it was such a fundamental misunderstanding of what the character was and was supposed to represent. In that sense, he's been completely defiled. So he also said, the vigilante anti-hero is fundamentally a critique of the justice system, an example of social failure. So when cops put Punisher skulls on their cars, or members of the military wear Punisher skull patches, they're basically siding with an enemy of the system. They are embracing an outlaw mentality. Whether you think the Punisher is justified or not, whether you admire his code of ethics, he is an outlaw. He is a criminal. Police should not be embracing a criminal as their symbol. In a way, it's as offensive as putting a Confederate flag on a government building. My point of view is the Punisher is an anti-hero, someone we might root for while remembering he's also an outlaw and a criminal. If an officer of the law representing the justice system puts a criminal symbol on his police car or shares challenge coins honouring a criminal, he or she is making a very ill-advised statement about their understanding of the law. So Gerry touches on some things I was also saying, but it's interesting to hear from the guy who helped create this character. And it does speak a lot to how they do mischaracterize what the Punisher is, because I feel like the character as a whole could be a good conduit into talking about a lot of issues. I think the Netflix show does an okay job with this, but of course, yeah, you know, talk about how badly veterans are treated in America, how disposable they are. You know, again, the Netflix show does this. Talk about PTSD and how it's not treated effectively. You can talk about corruption in government and police departments and how it's often hard to effectively get justice. And then you can also talk about, you know, the morals of it, you know, the violence versus, you know, more pacifistic methods that other superheroes often employ. Now that's all very interesting, but again, like Gerry has said, this character has essentially taken a life of his own within the conservative movement, within police departments, where all he stands for is violence against criminals. And there isn't a lot of nuance there. You know, to them the Punisher is awesome. He's not politically correct. He is a man of action. He's going to do what is necessary. He has no time for due process. He has no time for anything like that. And why it's so concerning at the moment, you see what's happening in America with all these vigilante killings. You see Kyle Rittenhouse essentially traveling from another state to go kill protesters at a Black Lives Matter demonstration. And of course I've made videos about the dehumanization of left-wing protesters, and do you honestly think the guys going around with Punisher skulls on their cop cars or on their guns or on their uniforms, do you honestly think these guys don't have a desire to carry out some justice against these protesters? Think of how the conversation's been framed in America. You know, Antifa are destroying the American way of life. All these communists, Black Lives Matter, Marxists, they're all allies, and they're coming to, I guess, destroy the American way of life. They're coming to take your guns. They're coming to put, I guess, liberal politics onto all of you guys, and if you don't like it, well, tough luck. And that's why people like Kyle Rittenhouse, not that I know that he's inspired by the Punisher, but his actions were largely celebrated by most prominent conservatives. Think about how insane that is. A guy travelling from a different state to a protest, then shoots dead 2 people who didn't have guns or weapons. He is celebrated. And you can see the through line from Chris Kyle loving the Punisher in Iraq, and then talking about coming back home and shooting looters during the flooding after Hurricane Katrina. You can see how that then translates to American conservatives in general, thinking what Kyle Rittenhouse did was not only defensible in a court of law, it wasn't only that, it's actually a positive thing which he did, because someone had to stand up to the violent mob, someone had to stand up to Antifa, and in their minds that someone would be the Punisher. The Punisher would never let this happen, so let's act more like the Punisher, let's use violence to deal with these criminals. And I think it's an interesting point that, you know, Gerry brings up, is that I guess conservatives again completely misunderstand a work of popular fiction, just like V for Vendetta, just like Fight Club, just like a whole host of different properties these right-wingers often co-opt for themselves, including, you know, The Matrix and red pilling. Matrix is a film about the struggle of being transgender, but Nazis and the general right have co-opted it into a thing about being not woke and being conservative and seeing through, I guess, the liberal or leftist bullshit. But it shows how they can't deal with nuance and they can't get the message of art. They just take something surface level and then use it for their propaganda. So I can see the frustration of a guy who wrote this character to then see it being used as just a stand-in for extrajudicial killing by the right wing. Anyway, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thanks for sticking with it. I'm super conscious of how my voice sounds. It's been a real struggle to get through this video just because I kept coughing and I'm all bunged up and stuff. But if you like the content, please like and maybe subscribe to the channel. Again, please check out my Patreon if you want to support my content. Also check out my social medias in the description. Follow me on Twitter at the Kavernacle, almost on 1,000 followers, so that would be cool to hit. Also on Instagram, check out my subreddit r/for-Kavernacle and my personal Reddit u/Tommy Cahill 1995. Everything else in the description as well, including my podcast. And if you made it this far, thank you for watching.